and move on to our next speaker, who is Rachel Trode from the European University Institute in Florence. Rachel will talk about reframing bureaucratic failure, civil servants and the nature of Habsburg rule in Bosnia. Rachel, take it away.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. All righty. So yes, as was mentioned, the title of my project is Reframing Bureaucratic Failure, Civil Servants and the Nature of Habsburg Rule in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So let's get into it. On May 26, 1906, the county chairman in Mostar, Karl Freiherr von Pittner, sent a report to his superiors at the provincial government in Sarajevo. In it, he described the conduct of his subordinate, the district chairman Georg Pavlić, in Ljubuški. According to Pittner, the district chairman's execution of his office was, quote, not completely bad, but also not good, end quote. Apparently, quote, Pavlić, to whom neither administrative procedure nor diligence can be denied, belongs to that class of district chairmen who, for their excessive good nature, never actually reaped the earned thanks of the population, and instead, however, lost every authority for himself and for his office, end quote. It was for this reason, the county chairman argued, that Pavlić should be transferred from his position. Traditionally, historians of Habsburg Bosnia have interpreted civil servants' failures, like that of district chairman Pavlić, in terms of the administration's ongoing attempts to secure control over the territory. If an administrator did not act as his superiors expected him to, then this was symptomatic of the provincial government's general inability to impose its will. But what if we stop to consider these moments of supposed bureaucratic failure on their own terms? What might we stand to gain? In the next 20 minutes, we will examine the case of District Chairman Pavlić as an example of this supposed bureaucratic failure. The district chairman allegedly mishandled a strike and later assembly that took place in the district of Ljubuški from May 17th into the 21st of 1906. I argue that by looking at how different civil servants explain this failure, we are actually able to examine how administrators understood their relationships to one another. Moreover, this has important implications for how we approach the study of civil servants and administrative practice across the Habsburg monarchy as a whole. So first, a little bit of context about Habsburg Bosnia. So as many of you I'm sure know, the Habsburg monarchy came to occupy Bosnia as a result of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. From this point on, we can divide the Habsburg rule in Bosnia sort of into two periods. The first is the occupation period between 1878 to 1908, and then the annexation period, with the annexation taking place in 1908 until 1914. And it's after 1908 that we see the introduction of a constitution, as well as an elected diet for the first time. But today we're going to be speaking about events that took place in 1906. So we're still talking about the occupation period, but the later part of the occupation period. Now, the administrative structure of Bosnia was a bit complicated because, as we know, after 1867, we have two different states. And the question was, where does Bosnia fit into this state system? And Habsburg statesmen got creative about this, and they decided they're going to place the administration of Bosnia under the Joint Ministry of Finance and the Joint Minister of Finance. So here we can see the layout of the administrative offices or units that that existed in Bosnia at the time. Of course, it's hierarchically organized with the Joint Ministry of Finance at the head in Vienna, and then we have the provincial government, which is the main central body in Bosnia and Sarajevo, and then below that the county offices, and then the district offices. And then, of course, in Bosnia, the administrative head is the civil adlatus, which doesn't really have a translation. I guess a governor might be the closest, but typically it's just referred to as civil adlatus. Then we have county chairman and the district chairman. So here we can see about our case today. These are the people who were in office at the time in 1906. So we have as Joint Minister of Finance, we have Burian, civil adlatus is Benko, county chairman, who we heard from earlier today in Mostar, is Pittner, and then our man of interest is district chairman Georg Pavlić in Ljubuški. And then here you can see There's a map of the administrative units of Bosnia in 1895, and the red arrow is pointing to where Ljubuški is at that point. So you can see that it's part of the county Mostar. Now, here we have this nice picture of Miriam sitting in his office. It's a bit later though, it's 1915 and he's foreign minister at this time. But it sort of begs the question, who are the civil servants in Bosnia at this time? Well, predominantly they came from Austria and Hungary. As you know, our people today are great examples of that. So Pavlić, for example, is born in Zagreb, Pittner in Trieste, and Benko is born in Prague. Tomislav Kraljačić has calculated in 1902, we have about 54% of civil servants in Bosnia come from Austria, about 30% from Hungary, and then about 15% are from Bosnia. And if you look a little bit closer, you also see that typically people from Bosnia tend to occupy lower positions within the administration at this time. An important thing to keep in mind also about civil servants in Bosnia is that their position really becomes regulated with the pension law in 1886, which essentially says that if you were to earn a pension in either Austria or Hungary, that you would continue to be able to do so as an employee of the civil service in Bosnia, because up until this point, there had been a lot of turnover actually of people coming to Bosnia. You know, they would come from positions in Austria or Hungary and work for a few years, and then they would return to those positions. So after 1886, you see a little bit more of a leveling out, a little bit more stability. In terms of the languages, civil servants were required to speak a Slavic language or the Landessprache in order to communicate with local peoples. But for the most part, the administrative internal language was German at this time. Another important thing to keep in mind is that over the period of Habsburg rule in Bosnia, we see an increasing number of civil servants working in the territory. So for example, in 1883, we have 470 civil servants working at the provincial, county, and district levels. And in 1902, we have 1,600 approximately. And the last point about them that we need to keep in mind also is that by 1906, by the time of the period we're looking at, the majority of civil servants who are working in these top positions, in these top sort of political positions, are people who had actually spent the majority of their careers working in Bosnia. And again, the three civil servants of our case are quite emblematic of that. Pavlić first comes to work in Bosnia in 1881, so he's been working there for 25 years at this point. Pittner, the county chairman, since 1889, so he's been there for 17 years. And then lastly, Benko has been working there for 26 years since the introduction of the civil administration in 1880, because between 1878 and 1880, there was actually a military administration. Now, civil servants, especially the chairman, were expected to carry out their administrative tasks as well as interact with and manage local people. In many cases, this also meant handling strikes, like the one that took place in Ljubuški in May 1906. Beginning on May 17th, local tobacco workers went on strike for higher wages. They later stormed a local hotel, attacked the administrators working at the tobacco purchasing station, before holding an assembly the next day where they were joined by other workers from the town as well as peasants from the surrounding villages. In the end, they produced a list of demands that went far beyond their initial concerns about wages to include demands for tax relief, the end of robot, among other sort of what was later considered political demands by the administrators. As we also can see, the events in Ljubuški, and particularly the district chairman's handling of them, became a moment of discussion regarding how administrators understood their relationships to one another. So District Chairman Pavlić himself was the first civil servant to express ideas about these kinds of relationships between administrators. For example, on May 18th, he sent a report to the provincial government. In it, he argued that he had correctly managed the strike in Ljubuški, namely that he had been right to request additional military assistance. In order to make his argument, the district chairman first asserted that both the strikers and the local security organs were a threat to public order. The strikers, he claimed, were violent since they destroyed both property and attacked administrators. For example, he wrote that they, quote, smashed all of the window panes of the local hotel, upheaved the iron door shutters, penetrated into all of the rooms, smashed glasses and bottles in the bar, annihilated food items and everything that came under their hands, end quote. Though Pavlić had access to gendarmes and locally garrisoned common army troops, he argued that both were insufficient to maintain Habsburg control over the situation. For example, he wrote that, quote, the town's police and the gendarmerie patrol were too weak to establish common order, end quote, and that the military officers in Lubushki only had a, quote, weak company left at their disposal, end quote. Now, what exactly he meant by weak here is quite unclear. It might have meant specifically the numbers of people they had available to them. But regardless, the district chairman argued that in their current state, they too posed a threat to his ability to maintain control. It was for this reason, namely a deteriorating security situation caused by a violent and unruly population and insufficient armed forces, that Pavlić argued he had, quote, applied to the superior county authority for the reinforcement of the garrison, end quote. The second way the district chairman supported his decision to request military assistance was by pointing to events that took place after he had already done so. So after he'd already called them in and made this decision to do this. In particular, he frames the arrival of the half company of 185 men from Mostar as a turning point. He no longer emphasized the ways that public order was threatened, but instead how the presence of the troops actually guaranteed Habsburg control in the area. Indeed, quote, the common order in the town was produced in an ideal way on the part of the military assistants, and there was in no case an occasion to make use of weapons, end quote. For him, the impact of the troops was proof that his decision to request the military assistance had been warranted in the first place. Moreover, by contrasting his earlier depiction of administrative authority under threat with a common orderly scenario above on the next day, the district chairman firmly asserted that he had correctly managed the issue. Thus, throughout his report, Pavlić sought to justify his decisions to the civil servants in Sarajevo. He understood that his role entailed detailing the reasons for his choices, like calling for military assistance, and he took great pains to do so throughout his entire report, carefully constructing this argument and setting the scene as we've seen. For him, then, the relationship between different administrators, particularly between the district and the provincial government, was defined in terms of accountability. The civil servants in Sarajevo also had very specific ideas about the way different administrators ought to interact with one another. An unnamed provincial administrator soon set out to make this viewpoint perfectly clear. After receiving their district chairman's reports, he wrote to the county chairman in Mostar on May 19th, calling for an investigation into Pavlić's conduct. Indeed, the author informed Pittner that, quote, the provincial government had gained the impression through the telegraphic reports it received from the district office in Lubushki that a number of blunders, inadequate measures, and administrative offenses had occurred. He distinguished in his report between three different kinds of failure in order to justify this investigation. First, the provincial administrator argued that Pavlić had incorrectly managed the flow of information between the district level and the provincial government. Specifically, he pointed out how the district chairman did not immediately send a telegram to Sarajevo when the strike broke out at the tobacco purchasing station, and instead had to be told to do so by the provincial administrators. Indeed, quote, considering the seriousness of the situation, Pavlić should have immediately and of his own accord made a telegraphic report, end quote. He expected the district chairman to begin sending information to the provincial administrators about the conflict as soon as he became aware of it. According to the civil servant, administrators like Pavlić should ensure that information constantly passed from the district level to the provincial government in such situations. Next, the provincial administrator described how Pavlić had failed to both collect and provide his superiors in Sarajevo with the right kind of information. In particular, the civil servant criticized the district chairman's decision to approve the strikers' request for an assembly, since in doing so, he completely disregarded the fact that assemblies could only be approved if they concerned only very narrow interests, or what the administration considered to be narrow interests, like workers' wages. According to the provincial civil servant, however, the district chairman's choice to approve the assembly stemmed from his own ignorance rather than a purposeful attempt to break protocol. He, quote, seemed to only have been superficially informed about the organizers and participants of this assembly, as well as about their aims and programs, end quote. The district chairman had neglected to gather the information necessary to decide whether or not the assembly should be approved in the first place. The civil servant in Sarajevo furthermore argued that Pavlić had also not sent sufficient detail about the strike or the assembly to the provincial government. even though it quickly became apparent that the assembly was indeed a political affair, according to the administration, and thus challenged broader Habsburg policies of rule in the territory, because remember, in the occupation period, there was a real sort of ban on political actions and political participation of people from Bosnia and in Bosnia. So Pavlić had not seen fit to offer an analysis of the event. The provincial administrators then sat in the Bosnian capital, quote, reading, quote, telegraphic reports that still did not assess at all the scope of the imminent political movement, end quote. They were much more interested here in understanding the motivations and aims of local political activists than to know why the district chairman had managed events in a certain way, which was what he was concerned about telling them. In this moment, certain types of information were much more relevant to governance than others. Lastly, the civil servant argued that even when Pavlić did manage to send information to the provincial government, he organized it improperly. This became clear in the conclusion of the administrator's report, where he asked County Chairman Pittner to go to Lubushki in order to provide the provincial administrators with a proper report on the entire incident. Specifically, the administrator requested that the county chairman write his report in a way that, quote, allowed for all events in chronological order, end quote. He wished to have an account that focused on the sequence of the events as they occurred on the ground. Pavlić's narrative clearly did not adhere to this standard. Rather, the provincial administrator found his messages to be, quote, in part rather confused, end quote. Indeed, when the provincial administrators eventually made their case for the district chairman's retirement to the Joint Minister of Finance, they used his report from May 18th to support their argument. Before sending it on to Vienna, the civil servants went through the document and wrote comments like what time and when in multiple places where Pavlić had apparently omitted the time a decision or event had occurred. According to them, the provincial administrators needed information from the district level to be ordered chronologically in order for it to be useful. Thus, in order to properly perform his duty as district chairman, the provincial administrator argued that Pavlić needed to be able to recognize when and how often to contact the provincial administrators directly, what kinds of detail they required given the situation, and finally, that they could only use his telegrams to make decisions if he clearly depicted the sequence of events on the ground. The provincial civil servants report demonstrates that the author very much understood the relationship between himself and his district counterpart in terms of the circulation of information or knowledge in this particular situation. So the last few minutes, I'll take some conclusions. So what does this example of bureaucratic failure tell us? Well, I would argue that first it demonstrates that oftentimes administrators had different understandings of their mutual relationships. Pavlić saw his relationship to the provincial administrators in terms of accountability, whereas the civil servants in Sarajevo understood this in terms of the circulation of information or knowledge. And ultimately, if you're curious about what happened to Pavlić, he was removed from office in July of that same year, but he wasn't fired outright. He was sort of put in a desk in the provincial government somewhere, and he didn't really have any more contact with local people. More importantly, however, I think the case of District Chairman Pavlić shows just how much we stand to learn about administrative practice and even governance by more carefully considering examples where civil servants are said to have failed. In the case of Lubushki, the administrators were discussing far more than how to properly handle a strike. They were discussing some of the fundamental aspects of Habsburg rule in Bosnia. That is, how are civil servants at different levels of the administrative hierarchy meant to interact with one another? So failure and the discussions around it then can be used as an analytical tool to help us explore this particular aspect of Habsburg governance. And of course, I would argue that this can be applied beyond Bosnia, since civil servants working there were certainly not the only ones to make mistakes, or that other colleagues argued were making mistakes. So by looking at administrative failure in different administrative contexts across the monarchy, I would think that this ultimately paves the way for a more comparative examination of administrative practice and rule. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.